Okay, we're going to talk about the cell. So we've spoken about chemicals and anatomical terminology. If you haven't turned in your guided notes for 1.1 and 1.2, make sure you do that. You can still turn it in. They would do Sunday night. So the cell. Okay, cells have uh, a membrane, and they're made out of a phospholipid. This phospholipid has a polar head and a hydrophobic tail. So this means that it has a charge or a charge imbalance. So you put a bunch of these phospholipids together, and you're going to have a cell membrane. Okay, so here's the polar head. So if you have a bilayer, okay, let's see what's happening. Somebody else trying to get in here. Okay, now let's get back to PowerPoint. Okay, so we're back here. Cells are formed when the cell membrane is formed when the polar heads face the outside of the cell and the hydrophobic tails dissolve in one another like dissolves like. So that's a cell membrane. There'll be a bunch of questions on cell membranes in the PowerPoint, in WebAssign. Cell membranes have proteins inserted into the membrane. Those proteins can act as enzymes, as transport proteins. There'll be questions on glycoproteins. These are glycolipids. So these are carbohydrate chains that'll be attached to the protein. That'll be a glycoprotein. If the carbohydrate is attached to the lipid, it's a glycolipid. So these help identify cells. These are calling cards or signs on the cell that help identify what type of cell we have. So there are membrane proteins, those that go across the entire membrane, and peripheral proteins. What do these proteins do? They transport materials from one side of the membrane to the other. We'll find out what they transport, such as sodium, potassium, glucose, and so on. When you have a ligand site, that's where a messenger can bind and cause the channel to open. So here's the receptor. A ligand can be a neurotransmitter, a hormone. And when the ligand binds to the receptor site, something happens, like the protein. The protein opens its channel, opens gates, and that way material can flow into or out of the cell. Some of these proteins in the membrane or enzymes speed up chemical reactions, but are not used up themselves. Other proteins provide structural support, help keep the shape of the cell, help the cell move around. It's a cytoskeleton. Sometimes we can have cells that are linked very close together. That helps seal the gut, for instance. These linker proteins can attach to cells very closely. Cholesterol is found in the membrane. Right here, for instance, I mentioned glycoproteins and glycolipids. Pay close attention to these definitions. There will be questions on WebAssign about glycolipids and glycoproteins. Understand the function of cholesterol in the membrane. Drugs act as ligands. Ligands agonists will usually stimulate a receptor. Antagonists will block a receptor. So this membrane is selectively permeable, meaning that okay, we have somebody trying to get in. Okay. Okay, so membranes let certain molecules in, like water, fatty molecules. There are two types of transport, passive and active. The cell has to move things into itself, and a cell that produces insulin has to get that insulin from within the cell to into the blood or into the plasma and so on. So what determines what goes in and out of the cell? The type of substance, how permeable the plasma membrane is, and the concentration in the cytosol and in the extracellular fluid. Oxygen and water can move into the cell by simple diffusion. Facilitated diffusion means there's a special channel that allows a substance to move through a special pipeline. We'll talk about osmosis in a moment. So, sorry to go back and forth, but I got to let people in. Or do I? Okay. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, we got 14 people. Back to the PowerPoint in the current slide. Okay, so a concentration gradient is when you have a very high concentration of a substance on one side of the membrane. If you put a dye in some water, it'll diffuse from the higher concentration to the lower concentration. Diffusion just means a substance diffuses from the higher concentration to the other side where there's a very low concentration until equilibrium is reached. Simple diffusion means that nonpolar molecules can diffuse right through the membrane. There's no need for a special channel or pipeline. Facilitated diffusion means that there's a special channel that helps transport charged or polar solutes. Okay, so such as sodium and potassium. Okay, let's stop there because I want to keep these under 15 minutes apiece. So we'll go back to the go back here, and we're going to turn off the stop recording for a moment. Okay, so